Session, day 2 of our Afrofuturism Conference. This is part of the Zora Neale Hurston Festival of Arts and Humanities, and we are very pleased to be bringing this program to you from UCF downtown and also from around the world. Our panelists are scattered about, and we've had a great day and a half, and this is going to be a wonderful concluding session. I'll just very briefly thank our program staff and the University of Central Florida Center for Humanities and Digital Research for hosting this event. And with that, I'm going to kick it over to my colleague, Dr. Julian Chambliss.
Thank you, Scott. It's my great pleasure and honor to introduce our keynote speaker for this afternoon, and that's Dr. Paul Ortiz. As you heard earlier in the day, Dr. Ortiz is director of the Samuel Proctor Oral History Program and professor of history at the University of Florida. He serves on the Faculty Advisory Council for the U.S. Center for Latin American Studies. And of course, he received his Ph.D. in history from Duke University in 2000. Dr. Ortiz is a third-generation military veteran and a first-generation university graduate. His pathway to academia includes many years of organizing for groups like United Farm Workers, the Farm Labor Organizing Committee, and other unions. And even today, he serves as United Faculty of Florida at UF union president. Dr. Ortiz gives us his time for his students in numerous ways, and he's a faculty advisor for UF Dream Defenders, Students for Bernie, and many other organizations on campus. In 2013, he received the Cesar E. Chavez Action and Commitment Award from the Florida Education Association, AFL-CIO. As a scholar, Dr. Ortiz's contributions are too numerous to name, and his books, of course, are a foundation for a lot of the work that we see related to civil rights and racial justice in the Florida context and beyond. His book, African American and Latinx History of the United States, was identified by Bustle as one of the 10 books about race to read instead of asking a person of color to explain things to you. Currently, Paul is writing Settler Colonialism and the War on Terror, 1492 to the Present, which will be published by Beacon Press. And of course, he has many other books as well. It's a real honor to have him here at Zora Neale Hurston Festival, and I'm really looking forward to his insights on Hurston and her continuing relevance to questions of freedom and culture in the United States. Paul.
Thank you so much, my dear colleague, Julian, and thank you so much for inviting me to this wonderful conference. It's a real honor and privilege for me. I've had also the great honor and joy to be able to work with Julian on a number of projects over the years, and it's always a delight to be with him in the same space and to talk about these weighty issues. You know, I was thinking about our panel this morning. What is the sound of Afrofuturism? And it's my contention today that Zora Neale Hurston has so much to teach us about how we might get to that sound, how we might identify it, how we might go into the spaces, virtual, real, physical, non-physical. Hurston, I believe, has a lot to show us, a lot to model for us in how we're going to get to these spaces where Afrofuturism is, where it's practiced, where it's dreamed of. We're not going to get there by using the standard academic tools. And we kind of talked about that a lot this morning. But I really want to urge people, if you do anything the rest of this week, to do what I was able to do, and what I'm so thankful that this conference really required of me to do, which was to pick up and to reread Zora Neale Hurston's Their Eyes Were Watching God. One of the magnificent texts in modern literature. any literature. I mean, I follow literature in different genres, different languages, and this book is it's an astonishing achievement. What I'd like to do this afternoon is to, again, talk about Hurston. I want to give a kind of a different read on Their Eyes Are Watching God, among other things, from an oral history perspective. Again, thinking about how would we use the tools and the clues and the storytelling devices that Zora Neale Hurston practiced in our own time, because we live in a time of tremendous crisis. We talked this morning about feeling like we live in a post-apocalyptic era. The apocalypse is here. The enemy is here. We've met the enemy. It is us. It is the society. This morning, a number of really shocking, but not so shocking headlines came out of CNN that in terms of even the COVID-19 vaccine procedure processes, white people getting vaccinated at much higher levels, having opportunities to have access to this important vaccination at much higher levels than African-American or Latino communities. And this is part and parcel of American history. And this is part of the death wish culture that we really have to break out of. And I think that, again, Hurston has so much to teach us about how we break out of that, how we break out of the corruption, how we break out of the deep sickness that has seized the society and that has kind of had the society by its throat many, many years before the global pandemic. It's just that the global pandemic has dramatized the sicknesses that govern the mainstream of US society. This is why Zora Neale Hurston, when she was trying to figure out where do I go to find out the truth, where do I go out to find inspiration, where do I go out to find a cosmology or a way of living that's sustainable, she doesn't go to the seats of power. She doesn't go talk to rich people. She doesn't even talk to middle-class people, let's be honest. She goes and she talks to poor people. She talks to working class people. She goes to Haiti. She talks to hoodoo conjurers. She talks to people who have direct connections to the African diaspora. I want to preface my presentation this morning, though, or this afternoon, and I'm going to do a screen share here in a moment, by giving you just a little flavor of a book that I'm working on. I've been asked by different publishers to write a book about my life in oral history, and I've kind of resisted that. And Palgrave Macmillan finally kind of got me to relent. And so I want to share just a piece of that book to give you a sense of what I mean when I talk about oral history. And let me start my screen share as I'm reading this passage here for you. Oral history is a testament to human survival, our aspirations for the future, and the struggle to retain one's dignity in an uncertain world. We tell each other stories about our heritages and where we come from in order to affirm foundational values and to prove that our lives have meaning. Without our memories, we have nothing to stand upon. Playwright August Wilson composed a cycle of riveting dramas to pose the question, quote, "Can you acquire a sense of self-worth by denying your past?" This proverb is a preeminent theme of the African diaspora. During the Middle Passage, enslaved African women collectively sung songs of cultures lost in order to steal each other to survive the horrific journey to the Americas. The British abolitionist Thomas Clarkson wrote of these women that, quote, "In their songs, they call upon their lost relations and friends. They bid adieu to their country. They recount the luxuriance of their native soil and the happy days they have spent there." Black bards use oral testimonies to preserve chronicles of the sacrifices needed to achieve and to sustain freedom. Work songs, ring shouts, religious sermons, jazz ensembles, as well as Decoration Day lectures given by Civil War veterans, bristled with lessons of faith, humility, and endurance. The characteristics that animated these diverse performative genres made them powerful tools of community building, including group participation, call and response cadences, an intense synergy between performers and observers. In James Baldwin's first novel, Go Tell It on the Mountain, the young minister in the story realizes that a successful sermon means that he must move his congregation from being passive observers to active listeners and actual participants in the liturgy. Like the oral history encounter between interviewer and narrator, audiences and performers in these sacred and secular encounters engaged in dialogical learning, where new meanings and forms of knowledge were being created and recreated. Subsequently, in Sonny's Blues, Baldwin described how a group of musicians led by a fiddler named Creole tells the story of their people's painful and exultant histories in a small Harlem nightclub. They do it without uttering a single word. The narrator observes, quote, he and his boys up there were keeping it new at the risk of ruin, destruction, madness, and death in order to find new ways to make us listen. For while the tale of how we suffer and how we are delighted and how we may triumph is never new, it must always be heard. There isn't any other tale to tell. It's the only light we've got in this darkness. End quote. It finally dawns on Sonny's brother, a member of the audience, that this is a reciprocal performance that demands participation from all. And the narrator of the novel says, freedom lurked around us, and I understood at last that he, Sonny on the keyboards, could help us to be free if we would listen, that he would never be free until we did. Once again, the watchers become interlocutors and stamp their own collective historical meanings on an intimate blues performance. And isn't it interesting? Work songs, ring shouts, religious sermons, jazz ensembles, Decoration Day lectures. I choose these spaces thinking about how Zora Neale Hurston was the one who taught us. There are others as well, but I think Hurston preeminently taught us that these were the spaces we needed to go to hear the sounds of our times, the sounds of Afrofuturism, the sounds of freedom. Think about what it was like to go to an Emancipation Day ceremony in Florida when Hurston went to those ceremonies. In Northern Florida, May 20th, the day that the Union Army, the 3rd United States Colored Troops, liberated Tallahassee. Think about what it was like to be there with the elders, the survivors of slavery, sitting in a front row place of honor, the children competing in their schools to be chosen to be the one to read the poem, the ring shout, the maypole. To white academics of the time, these events must have seemed bizarre and otherworldly. Academics at my university, University of Florida, had read African-American people out of the polity altogether. But Zora Neale Hurston knew where to go to get to the truth. And so these are spaces where she went. So how to get to the sound, what is the sound of Afrofuturism? For those of us who have just joined us, my argument is this afternoon, is that Hurston has so much to teach us. I want to talk especially about Mules and Men and Their Eyes Were Watching God. I want us to think about a different way to understand Their Eyes Were Watching God. I love reading what Alice Walker, what Henry Louis Gates, there's a great genre of literary criticism about their eyes. And I've learned so much from it. But as an oral historian, I approach Their Eyes Are Watching God from a much different vantage point. Whereas Janie Crawford is the protagonist to most people who read the book and watch the film was quite interesting. There was a film that came out in the early several years ago. As an oral historian, I read Their Eyes Watching God much differently. I'm thinking about Phoebe much more than Janie Crawford in many ways, because Phoebe is the key to the story. She is the interlocutor, if you will, played in the movie by Nikki Michaud. Two Black women on a porch, both equally important to the telling of the story. What types of questions does Phoebe ask Janie to help Janie take us back through this incredible odyssey, one of the greatest odysseys in modern literature? And the kind of dance they do leading up to the actual interview, where they're on the porch and Janie Crawford is telling her story and Phoebe is asking her these questions. Now, we don't hear the questions, right? But we know they're there. We know no person could tell such an odyssey, a story, in one run. It just doesn't happen. It's Phoebe who's the one who's giving the cues. It's Phoebe is the one who's asking the questions. It's Phoebe the one who provides the most important part of the oral history process, which is the audience. Without the audience, there's no story, right? And I get nervous when I read Their Eyes Were Watching God, because I'm thinking, again, being on this porch, and I've been on that porch so many hundreds and hundreds of times, in that moment of possibility, but also almost like terror. Like, how do you start an interview? You're sitting down with someone who has a wealth of experiences that you don't have. That's the reason you're there, because you're there to learn. When I go to do an oral history interview, I take my professor's cap off and I put it in the closet where it belongs. I leave campus, and I'm a learner. Again, I'm a listener. And so when I begin to read Their Eyes Were Watching God, and then we get to the point where Janie has come back to the town, back to Eatonville, her beloved Eatonville. People are talking, right? They're gossiping. They're doing what they do in small towns. But that moment when Phoebe gets Janie to sit down with her, and I want us to understand that's a willful act. Phoebe is just as much of an agent in that exchange as Janie is. And I think oftentimes we miss that because of obviously the brilliance of Janie, the incredible arc of her story. But again, we're not going to get that story without Phoebe. And it's a story that we need more than ever. It's a story that connects to our time. This morning I mentioned that it's really amazing to me when we think about Afrofuturism going backward and forward in time, in different dimensions and different experiences existing at the exact same time, that the 1928 Okeechobee hurricane, which is the backdrop for Their Eyes Were Watching God, is now referred to as the Hurricane Katrina of its time. It was not a natural disaster. Authorities knew that the dike around the lake was in bad repair, just like their counterparts in Johnstown knew in 1890 that dike was in bad repair, just like the officials in New Orleans knew that New Orleans wasn't prepared. And so these are not natural disasters. Hurricane Katrina in 2005, or Okeechobee hurricane, or even the hurricane that hit 2 years before, the Miami hurricane, which cost so many Black lives. But like the vaccines today that are going to white people, when Black and brown people are dying at actually much higher rates, it seems like the rulers of the society either don't care, or maybe they plan for us to die at higher rates. But this is the backdrop for Their Eyes Were Watching God, the 1928 Okeechobee hurricane. the initial estimates of the dead were about 1,500. That's been revised significantly higher. My guess is it's going to be revised even higher. Many African Americans, many migrant workers. As the shocking sequence of the 1920 hurricane in Their Eyes Were Watching God, and it mirrors the reality where white people are taken out oftentimes and buried with dignity, individual graves. African Americans are thrown into a mass grave. But this is why I think Their Eyes Were Watching God is a story for our time. Remember how James Baldwin talked about innocence and how American society is stuck, cannot grow, cannot be successful on its own terms, cannot be human, because this society holds on and cherishes its innocence to a pathological state. We can't admit mistakes. Other nations make mistakes. Other nations have flaws. The US never does anything bad by purpose. Oh, Vietnam, well, we had the best intentions. Korea, we had the best intentions. Iraq, Afghanistan, we always had the best intentions, right? Just things didn't turn out somehow. Baldwin said we had to lose that innocence if we're ever going to grow as a society. And this is what Black literature can teach us, how to lose our innocence and how to look at the world more realistically, because this is what Their Eyes Were Watching God about. Janie saw her life like a great tree and leaf, with the things suffered, things enjoyed, things done and undone. Dawn and doom was in the branches. You can't separate these things out. Their Eyes Were Watching God is so much better than reading a US history textbook, where the US history textbook, and I know because I was trained in this, I got my Ph.D. in US history. And when I was at Duke, some of my advisors, they would taunt us. They would say, you know, you all think you're radical, but you're all being trained to defend American exceptionalism and the fact that this is the greatest country on earth. Well, this isn't the greatest country on earth in Black literature. And that's where we need to go to. We need that we need these wake-up calls. Dawn and doom is in the branches. So joy and suffering, the way they are in real life, are in this book. They don't just happen to people in other countries. They don't just happen to people in the global South. They just don't happen in El Barrio or the ghetto. They happen everywhere. So I made the argument today that Their Eyes Were Watching God is as much Phoebe's story as it is Janie's. Oral history is dialogical learning. It means that when I sit down with you and I'm interviewing you or you're interviewing me, we're working together to mutually construct meaning. This is what we try to do at the Samuel Proctor Oral History program. And I'm so excited to report to you that younger people more than ever are willing to go out, and even on Zoom, because the global pandemic has stopped us from being able to do face-to-face interviews, right? But younger people are more interested in listening than ever. If you look at the Black Lives Matter movement, and I'll talk about that in a moment in connection to Zora Neale Hurston, in Florida, the Dream Defenders, when they formed in the wake of the murder of Trayvon Martin, one of the first things they did was, they got active. And this really becomes a core of the Black Lives Matter movement from Florida. Younger people creating that, high school students, college age people, right? But one of the first things that the Dream Defender organizers did was they invited their movement elders to meet, because they understood, as 14, 15, 16-year-old youth, this isn't the first time that Black people have started to create an insurrection. And so let's talk to our movement elders. And they called on people like Angela Davis, Congressman John Lewis. Very important. Oral history is about intergenerational learning. And this is so much of what Hurston's fieldwork is. Zora Neale Hurston was obsessed with the idea of making sure that younger generations of people understood the profundity of African working class cultures, secular, sacred, whether in Haiti, whether in British Honduras, whether in Florida, whether in New Orleans. The intergenerational part of this is so critical. Remember what August Wilson says, can you live a full human life by forgetting your past? And he uses that magnificent 10-place cycle to give a answer in capital letters, no, you cannot. So in creating the character of Phoebe, Hurston is really modeling for us the ways in which we could go out today and find and learn about the sounds of Afrofuturism. She's modeling for us what it takes to be a great folklorist, a great oral historian, a great intellectual. Humility, empathy, sorry for the misspelling, passion, active listening. You can let's imagine Phoebe on that porch. Is she sitting back? No. She's leaning forward towards Janie, her eyes aglow. She's gesturing. Remember, Hurston has her moving on the porch physically. She's so nervous, okay? So this is an active listening. And what comes out of it? There's so much we could talk. We could spend days, right, Julian, talking about what is in their eyes are watching God. I only have a few more minutes, and so I'll just talk, obviously, this is a novel about becoming. It's a feminist anthem, as Alice Walker taught us. It's about the dignity of the Black working class, the beauties, the tragedies, the triumphs of Black culture. And it's also about our society as it is, not as we would like it to be. There's no way on earth you can get around the ending of this novel. Both the relationship, of course, between Janie and Tea Cake, the Okeechobee Hurricane, but the incredible ending too, where Phoebe says, I'm going to use this story. I'm going to go back to my man. We're going to go fishing. And I'm going to talk to people in this town called Eatonville. And this is another wonderful thing about oral history. It's all about social change. If you want, it's about revolution. Phoebe is going to create a revolution in gender relations in her town. And it's the story which really leads her to do it. But I want to emphasize again, the hard part of this process, the hardest part is the listening. Look, I'm a professor. I can lecture on these things for hours, and all I need is a cup of coffee every once in a while. Take a sip now, and I can go for hours. But after 1 hour, y'all listening are going to be like, "Oh my gosh, when is he going to shut up?" We're just falling asleep, right? Listening is hard work, and Hurston is the greatest listener I've ever encountered. If you have the opportunity to ever, and I want to urge you, I do have one musical clip to play. I'm not sure if it's going to work, but I do have the lyrics in a few minutes. You've not really encountered Hurston until you listen to her talking about her fieldwork. And if you can, listening to her talking to people like Stetson Kennedy, or especially the recordings where she's talking, I'll never forget the first time, when I was a graduate student and I was in the Library of Congress. And at that point, the folklore collection was really just getting reorganized. Archie Green had done a lot of work on that. One of my former students, by the way, Sean Burns, wrote a magnificent biography of Archie Green. But I walked into this room. It was the folklore room, and it was the old folk. This is back in the 90s, y'all. So it's a long, I'm an old man, right? But 1994, 95, I walk into this room in the Library of Congress, and there's a table, and it's stacked with cassette tapes. Remember those old timers, cassette tapes? And they all had labels, and probably half of them, you know the deal with cassette tapes. You know, the label says one thing, but you don't really know what's on it until you pop it in the recorder. And I swear to God, they had an old school Radio Shack recorder. Remember Radio Shack? Sitting on the table. So I look at these tapes and I'm going through them, and there's one that's labeled Florida. And that's all it said. And so, you know, I'm writing my dissertation on the Black freedom struggle in Florida. So I'm like, okay, let's see what's on here. So I pop the tape in, hit play. And lo and behold, I listen. And it's the sound of a middle-aged African-American woman who's singing a song, a lining song. And she'll stop and she'll say, did I get it right? And it's clear that the people responding back to her are not academics, they're not folklorists, they're not professors. The people talking back to her are railroad workers, railwaymen, as they were called, Black railwaymen. And I realized within a minute or so, this is Zora Neale Hurston. This is how she did her craft. Amazing. She's grounding, the term Walter Rodney would use in a later generation. She's grounding with railway workers. And she wants to make sure that she's getting it right. She's not just there to record. That's not enough. She has to understand the inflection of these songs, why they were sung the way that they were sung. But getting back to Their Eyes Were Watching God, listen to Black women. What happens when we listen to Black women? We could be part of a global social movement that's never been seen before. The Black Lives Matter movement was started by African-American women. Listen to Black women. That's the takeaway of Their Eyes Are Watching God. And there's just, again, so many, I'm gonna have to move away from Their Eyes Are Watching God in just a second, but this one passage is so full of meaning, where you can see Janie breaking away from the male-dominated relationship that she's in with Starks. And she has this epiphany, but it happens in a group. It's very important how that happens. It isn't just one-on-one. It isn't the nuclear family thing. The things that are incredible that happen in this book happen in groups of people. And Janie speaks up in a way that she's never spoken up before, and it stuns her soon-to-be ex-husband. She's making a break, but she's doing it in a collective kind of way, a collective kind of environment. So if we were like in a class, if this is like an all-day retreat or something, you know, now would be the breakout session. And I would ask you to make a list, like make Phoebe's interview guide. What questions does she ask? What questions would we ask today to get to the important problems, issues of our time? So I went there to ask. Remember, Hurston is the master listener, but you also have to be able to ask questions at certain moments. And Hurston was a person, remember Frantz Fanon, oh my body. Make of me a person who asks questions always. So getting to Mules and Men, and I don't want to separate these. I don't see the need to separate Mules and Men. I don't see the need to separate Hurston's ethnographic folklore oral history work from her novels. Because obviously the pitch I'm making to you is that Their Eyes Were Watching God is a tremendous novel written by a person who also happens to be an incredible ethnographer, right? But one of the things, and I highly suggest, Valerie Boyd's Wrapped in Rainbows is a tremendous there's so many books written about Hurston. I should have put a bibliography together, but Valerie Boyd's book is really something. It's really amazing. And here she's trying to talk about this question of why Hurston believed that Black working class life was so important and so important to portray. And Valerie Boyd is reminding us that when we get to that part about 2/3 of the way through Their Eyes Are Watching God, this is where great things are happening. This is where Janie's coming into her own. But again, it's not kind of the individual bourgeois way of coming into one's own, right? It gets very collective. It's very working class. These are migrant workers, seasonal workers. They're very poor people, but they're building this incredible culture. They're building this incredible life where an African-American woman is able to come into her own and become a foremost speaker and storyteller in this community of storytellers. And it's such a sharp contrast to her bourgeois life as a mayor's wife in Eatonville. Isn't it such a contrast? So much so that when she comes back to Eatonville, her neighbor's like, who are you? You're wearing overalls. Like, what's that about, right? The Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, John Lewis, pictures of him as a young man wearing overalls, trying to ground with Black working class communities in the Mississippi Delta. I talked earlier about James Baldwin, so I'm not going to read this, but I think Baldwin is one of the writers who understands these dynamics. Others include Alice Walker, Toni Morrison, Langston Hughes. I enjoy reading these authors kind of one right after the other. I don't see the need to pit them against each other, but there's an understanding here of the dialogical form of knowledge. There's an understanding that the dichotomies between performer and audience just don't kind of make sense. This is Zora Neale Hurston's methodology. And I've listened to this, and again, I urge you, the Florida Memory site, the Library of Congress Folklife site, you can listen to Zora Neale Hurston grounding with the people that she's collecting the material from, repeating their songs, repeating their poetry, repeating their stories. And then I sing them back to the people until they're telling me I can sing just like them. And she wants to make sure, in other words, she's rehearsing, not in a marketing sense, right? But she's rehearsing to the people who created it. This morning we talked about cultural appropriation, right? Zora Neale Hurston was not into the cultural appropriation thing. I mean, Greg Tate was mentioned this morning as a wonderful book about the cultural appropriation of Black forms of culture. Hurston is always trying to guard against this, but there's an unequal power relationship, right? She's not the head of the Florida WPA Writers Project Unit. She's not a publisher. She has to work with these people in Lippincott. She has to work with these people in WPA who have a different vision of Black literature. Valerie Boyd has told us that Dust Tracks in the Road would have been a much different book had Hurston been able to write uncensored, okay? So this issue of cultural appropriation is definitely a big issue. Now I want you to, I'm not sure if you're gonna be able to hear this, but you can see the lyrics here. And this is going, I'm kind of moving towards a conclusion, but I want us to think about railroad lining songs, because if you're talking about intergenerational music, you're talking about connections this morning between jazz, blues, hip hop. Mention was made of the Ghetto Boys, Houston, where my family's from. My father's generation, grandfather grew up there. The elders, and you talk about, Tejano, border music, they don't see the clear delineations. They think of these musics in a continuum, right? And So if you look at the lining song, I'll just play this, and this is a clip of, and again, you may be able to hear it and maybe not, but this is Hurston at first talking about this song and its context, and then singing it. So whether or not you can actually hear it.
This song is called Shove It Over, and it's a line and rhythm pretty generally distributed all over Florida. It was sung to me by Charlie Jones on the railroad construction camp near Lakeland, Florida. I gathered that in 1933. When I get in Illinois, I'm going to spread the news about the Florida boy. Shove it over. Hey, you catch a line there. Oh, catch a like. Can't you move it? Hey, can't you try? Eat him up, whiskers, he won't shave. Eat him up, body like he won't bathe. Shove it over. Hey, can't you line there? Oh, shaka like. Can't you move it? Hey, can't you try? Oh, the rooster chew tobacco, the hen dip a snuff. The biddy can't do it, but he struts his stuff. Shove it over. Hey, can't you line there? Oh, shaka like. Can't you move it? Hey, can't you try? Check I'm a woman walking across the field. A mouth exhausted like an automobile. Shove it over. Hey, you catch a line there. Oh, shaka like. Can't you move it? Hey, can't you try? The captain got a pistol. He tried to play bad, but I'm gonna take it if it make me mad. Shove it over. Hey, can't you line there? Ah, shaka like. Can't you move it? Hey, can't you try?
This again for lining.
This is a lining rhythm.
So hopefully you could hear that, but if not, Shove It Over, Can't You Line It is available on the Florida Memory site. And it's just worth, I've listened to it just over and over again. But the kind of rigor, if you think of yourself, if you're a writer or a performer and you're like, I got to get this right. You rehearse, you perform over and over again, even before you get on the stage. That's kind of like what Zora Neale Hurston was. She would practice these songs over and over again with the people who created them initially, because for her, getting it right was so very important. But one of the things I wanted to share with you was, what were these communities like that she worked in? We know that Hurston did a lot of work in phosphate mining camps and turpentine camps. If you look here, this photograph of the turpentine camp, and you're familiar with Hurston's work, you know that a lot of Black turpentine workers talked about the woods rider, right? That's the white man who's mounted on the horse on the extreme edge of this photograph. It's an interesting photograph, right? You know the guy is posing here, and he's trying to make it seem as if he's in charge. On the left is a portrait of white phosphate miners. These were very tough communities, tough working class communities. We know that Hurston, sometimes when she went out to do her field work, went out armed. She carried a pistol with her at times. And she had people like a woman by the name of Big Sweet, who plays such an important role in Mules and Men, her kind of female bodyguard, okay, to make sure she's safe. But the kind of community and the kind of people who created that song, Shove It Over, and with so many different lyrics, who were they? And so, when I was writing my dissertation and my book, Emancipation Betrayed, doing oral histories for me was like really critical. But remember, I was doing oral histories in the 90s. Hurston had done these in the 20s and 30s. And then I was able to use her work and go back to the 1890s. And I want to read for you a passage from Emancipation Betrayed that talks about an event where African Americans came together in one of the communities that Hurston later did fieldwork in to stop a lynching from occurring, to give you a sense of who the people were that she was doing fieldwork with. And the backdrop to this is a man by the name of Benjamin Reed. He's an African American teamster who gets into a fight with his supervisor. It comes to blows, and he ends up killing his supervisor. And at that point, white people gather in Jacksonville, this is where it happens, to lynch him, to lynch Benjamin Reed. But instead of a lynching, this is what happens. African Americans surround the jail where Benjamin Reed is being held. By 11 p.m., armed sentries were patrolling the immediate perimeter of the jail and questioning every white man who approached the area. Whites with no business near the courthouse were asked to leave. Eventually, dozens of African Americans filled the approaches leading to the jail. This emergency militia was solidly working class, or in the Times Union's preferred phrasing, quote, this Negro mob was composed of the riffraff of the colored population. But this mob was well organized. Black sentinels stood in each corner, and when a white man would pass, they would ask him about where he was going. A whistle signal would be then passed on to the next corner, and the pedestrian would be surrounded and followed. If he went in the direction of the jail, the Negroes would close in upon him, and he would soon find himself covered by 50 or more cocked revolvers. This is in 1892. How did African Americans in Florida organize this self-defense operation so rapidly? One of the members of the armed resistance was Dan Treven, a cook. According to the police reports, Treven says he was sent out by one of the colored secret societies of which he's a member. Remember, Hurston takes great care to talk about the importance of secret societies in Black communities all across the Americas, right? Treven says he was sent out by one of the colored secret societies of which he is a member. Another person arrested was Ben Dilworth, a local minister who was accused of making an incendiary speech in front of the post office. Alonzo R. Jones, quote, a coal-black Negro who had served in the police department before Jacksonville's biracial city government was deposed by the state legislature in 1899. Furthermore, the Black working class in Jacksonville was itself well organized. Lower income workers were members of such groups as the Longshoremen's Associations. Lower income workers were also members of washerwomen's unions, as well as burial societies. This defense of Benjamin Reed in 1892 came to the attention of none other than Ida B. Wells. Those of you who've read a Red Record know this story already. Ida B. Wells personally lauded African Americans in Florida for stopping the lynching of Benjamin Reed. Wells drew upon the episode in Jacksonville to formulate her doctrine of armed self-help as an example for Black Americans across the country to emulate. Wells observed, quote, of the many inhuman outrages of this present year, the only case where the proposed lynching did not occur was where the men armed themselves in Jacksonville, Florida, and Paducah, Kentucky, and prevented it. And she goes on later, of course, her famous utterance, a Winchester rifle should have pride of place at the heart of every self-respecting Negro. So these were the communities that Zora Neale Hurston worked in. And this is what I think leads to her very distinctive understanding of African-American working class cultures, where academics saw dysfunction, family breakdown, bad things. Hurston dissented mightily. She said there's a resilience in these working class cultures. You call them ghettos, you call them backwards, but there's a lot of amazing things happening here. There's a whole cosmology that people have created. Remember the John stories. There's Jack and there's many other people too. But my gosh, this is a cosmology of the universe where people can outsmart God and the devil. Sit down sometime and read some of those stories from Mules, or I mean, read Mules and Men. It's one of the magnificent books that's been produced in this country's history. And imagine a people with the resilience to create a whole cosmology where there's a sacred, there's a secular, there's not a clear demarcation, but that ordinary people have the wherewithal to talk about outsmarting the God and the devil. And those who have read Mules and Men and other works by Hurston about New Orleans know the story of Marie Lebeau. I love this story. I'm not going to read it to you. You may have heard it. My gosh. Again, listen to Black women. It's a great, what's being told here, and I love how Hurston writes about this. She says, we believe, we tell the story, okay? So right away, she again challenging the dichotomy between the academic and the audience. But here she's talking about how a Black woman totally flabbergasts and beats the police, like physically, spiritually, mentally, every which way, right? I just love this story. And in the end, the whole New Orleans Police Department comes to try to take Marie Lebeau out, and then she just puts him to sleep. She's very gentle in the end. After she kind of knocks him around a little bit, she just puts him to sleep. White folks, go to sleep, okay? I got other things to do. It's a really amazing story. So at that point, or at this point, I thank you for being a very patient audience. And again, the point I was trying to make as an oral historian, it's harder to listen than it is to speak. I could talk about Zora Neale Hurston for all day, but I just want to thank Julian and all the organizers of this amazing event for giving us a space to talk about Afrofuturism and Zora Neale Hurston. Wow, what an amazing experience. So thank you.
Thank you, Paul. I really appreciate your great reflections on Hurston as really a interdisciplinary scholar and creative, and those contributions. I think we have time for some questions. I want to start out because there is a question about works, and you sort of mentioned this. There's a whole constellation of work about Hurston. What work would you recommend that people look into when they want to understand Hurston, or how would you sort of place Hurston in conversation with other works and other scholars and other creators?
Well, Julie, for me, it begins with Alice Walker, and I think that's where my journey to Zora Neale Hurston first began. I think as an undergraduate. I mean, I should have been reading her way years earlier, but I think that Alice Walker's ruminations on not just the brilliance of Hurston's writings, but the journey, the struggles against sexism, the way that she passed away, the unmarked grave, the journey to that the homage that Alice Walker is paying to Zora Neale Hurston is one of the most beautiful stories I've ever read. And so I always say, start right there, I do love the fact that, I'm a big fan of Valerie Boyd's biography, Wrapped in Rainbows. I think it's a wonderful, rumination of, and what Boyd is trying to do is she's trying to understand the totality of Zora Neale Hurston's life. I think it's an impossible task, right? I just don't think one author can do it. But Valerie Boyd does a pretty darn good job. And she's trying to understand the prehistory of Hurston's life, the Notasulga, Alabama. Man, I didn't know that story. It's so interesting because I did field work in Macon County, including Notasulga, when I was a grad student. I didn't know Zora Neale Hurston was born there. I always thought it was Eatonville, right? And what Boyd does in a playful way is she takes us through why Zora Neale Hurston emphasized certain aspects of her life and then downplayed others. The thing about the age, right? But no, I would start there. I would start with Alice Walker. I would start with Valerie Boyd, tremendous work. What I would caution folks against is that, and now I'm not a literary scholar. I'm a historian who loves books, but I have had the opportunity to hear, to hear Toni Morrison and Ishmael Reed talk about these issues. And one of the things that they both cautioned us about were types of literary criticism that pit Black authors against each other, like there's some kind of battle royale, right? And so sometimes they'll see, oh, well, Hurston did this, Langston Hughes did that, and and then you have the Black proletarian writers, and they, and Hurston, and I'm not saying that literature is bad, and a lot of it's very valuable and very fruitful. I'm just saying that first, I would highly suggest, number one, going directly to Hurston. Again, Their Eyes Were Watching God, but Moses of the Mountain is a magnificent book as well. Read Hurston first, and then kind of make up your mind about how you want to, situate her if you want to think about her in tandem with other, with other Black writers. I'm thinking about some kind of project where if you have to really talk about Hurston with other writers of the time, why not? A lot of people have done the Fannie Hurst comparison. That's obviously, they knew each other, they worked with each other periodically. But why not William Faulkner? To me, there's so many like really, amazing possible connections there. But anyway, I'm starting to ramble a little bit. It's a really good question.
And I really appreciate the emphasis you place on Hurston as an ethnographic scholar and the methodology of oral history. I think this is a question that I think a little bit about in my own process a little bit, in the sense of how should we value or how should we institutionalize the oral history? And this really becomes like a question of a kind of institutional relationship to the histories being collected. Where do they fit in the academy? I know that this is at some level a clear answer for you, but not always a clear answer for the public. And I think about this in the context of some of the questions we've had about sound and its value in terms of transmitting information. So, what should we be telling people about oral history and its institutionalization in terms of systems and society?
Yeah, it's a really important question. I think one of the things, those of us who work in university-based or museum-based, oral history programs have a way of answering this. One of the things I think that's so important right now is we should be just kind of cheerleading and urging, different types of institutions to create their own archive. And to continue to build on the archives they do have. What I mean by this is that, so the Samuel Proctor Oral History Program, we've worked with different churches throughout Florida. Macedonia Church comes to mind, just a little south of where you're talking to us from. And it's a historically Black church. They had started an archive. All we really did in the Proctor program was went to the church for 2 days and did a series of workshops and did, kind of train the trainer kind of workshop. We brought some digitizing equipment. We helped them think about purchasing their own equipment, which they subsequently did. And really, in a sense, so that the church itself can create its own archive. Now, not all institutions can do that. I mean, Macedonia is a large historically Black church, with some resources saved. But I think the key is collaboration. Why can't we at institutions like UCF and UF and others, work with the communities around us, to help, build their capacity for creating their own, archive. I mean, now's the time to do it. I mean, the Black Lives Matter movement has opened so many new spaces to talk about history, to talk about issues of anti-Black violence, to talk about racism. And more people than ever are interested in creating archives. And, you know, you alluded to this morning about the new technologies. You know, it broke our hearts in last March to shut down face-to-face interviewing. But, you know, we learned Zoom. We've always done phone interviews, right? And so we're probably doing as many interviews now as we did before the pandemic. The problem again is access. I mean, you know, we try to interview farm workers in Immokalee, they're not likely going to have, you know, Zoom technology. So there's questions, there's problems, but, you know, I think working collectively, we can approach those.
I want to see if there's a question from Orlando. Yeah.
First, I just want to say that was a wonderful talk. Thank you so much. I really enjoyed it. And one thing that really jumped out to me, I appreciated you talking about how Hurston emphasized ordinary people's experience. That's something I think has really gone through both days talking about. But what jumps out to me is that Their Eyes Were Watching God is a book that's assigned in classrooms across the United States. I read it in, I think, middle school in Indiana and barely understood it without the context. You know, now Florida State has mandated teaching of the Ocoee massacre, but without really the I think if I had the context of knowing about these Black communities, and I could have gotten so much more out of, you know, as a school student reading this book, reading Their Eyes Were Watching God, or if I was a Florida student learning about the Ocoee massacre. What is it that you think is most important that students understand about the context of these communities to really help them understand these things to the fullest way that they can? And do you think that what you were talking about as far as community archives and those sorts of efforts, or is there a way to connect those things? I don't know if that's a great question, but
yeah, no, it's a really important question, and thank you very much for mentioning also, you know, the statewide law mandating the teaching of the events leading up to the Ocoee Election Day massacre. This is one of the most important things that's happened in the state of Florida in recent years. This is an astonishing breakthrough that was made possible by, you know, literally tens of thousands of people like laboring in the vineyards for years and years, saying, you know, hey, we need to like commemorate this. And, you know, the people in Ocoee and what they've done. And I've been so privileged and humbled to be able to be a very small part of that process. I think that the short answer, though, and I apologize because I'm giving you a very elliptical response to your very concise series of questions. The short answer, again, is to go back to Hurston. And the short answer is field work. And what I mean by this is going to these communities. Like one of the things we do in the Proctor program is 2 summers ago, not this past summer, but 2 summers ago, we were invited to travel to Elaine, Arkansas, to help commemorate and document the 100th anniversary of the Elaine massacre, a horrific anti-Black massacre that involved, you know, federal troops who just came back from World War I were sent to gun down and murder Black small farmers. And it's you know, like the Ocoee massacre on a different scale. All of this Black owned farmland is seized by white realtors and developers, and then they flip it, you know. And it's such a horrific event, but for decades there was silence about it. But now these communities are organizing. You know, they're organized in Ocoee, they're organized in Elaine, Arkansas, they're organized in Newberry, Florida. I mean, our county, in Alachua County, has the Alachua County Remembrance Committee. And so we're talking about lynching that occurred here in Alachua County. But the reason that Hurston's fieldwork comes to mind is it's so important to go out there and to talk to people and to kind of listen to their experiences, their hopes, their traumas, the sorrows, but also the joy they have of feeling that these stories are being told for the first time, or that there's a new audience. I have, you know, I actually want to read just a very short passage of an African-American in Latinx history of the United States, because this, and Julian is very familiar with this story because Julian was the one who actually steered me to this story, right? It's a story of the lynching, or what we thought was a lynching of Oscar Mack in Kissimmee, Florida, in 1923. Julian was able to make contact with Oscar Mack's great-grandson, who was able to tell him, and then subsequently tell a group of us, that that his elder had actually escaped this lynching and had went north and had lived a whole different life. And we went to interview him a few years ago, and with Julian and some other, and also some graduate students. But when we did the interview, Oscar Mack's descendant made it very clear about how he wanted the story to kind of be told. And this is the passage I want to read for you. Oh, wrong glasses. As you get older, this is gonna be your fate. Putting on my driving glasses to try to read a passage here. Some people say I should get bifocals. Anyway, okay. After a gun battle in which he killed 2 of his attackers, Oscar Mack fled on foot to the north. For much of the rest of his life, Mack lived under an assumed name, on the run from white terrorists. Mack's great-grandson vowed to turn a family tragedy into a story of redemption and reconciliation. He said, "This means a lot to me, not only for him, but for all the other people who are lying in their graves, who were never heard, who were treated not even as second-class citizens in this country, not only for Black people, but for Hispanics, for women, for any other minority group, if you will. We have talked about the fact that our government is saying, 'Make America great again.' I cannot see where she was ever great. The bare fact is that in this country, over 50 million Native Americans were murdered, and Black people were enslaved, and other ethnic groups were disenfranchised. So it was never great. But I do believe now, because of the stories that are surfacing, we can use these as a tool to bring people out of their ignorance." And this is the kind of spirit that we're seeing all across the country, people telling their stories in new ways, in some cases being assisted by new forms of technology, but, new collaborations, coming into being, community groups, museums, schools. The story of the Ocoee Massacre is going to take a lot of work. And whenever I talk about it in Florida, I always conclude with a charge to my audience. And my charge is, okay, parents, students, community members, what are we going to do? How are we going to make this happen? Because our teachers didn't go to school learning about the Ocoee election massacre. They didn't, their colleges of ed, in no college of ed that I know of in Florida was this incident talked about. And so now you're telling me it's got to be taught in 67 school districts. So that's on us, not just the professionals, that's on all of us. And so that kind of gets back, I think, to your question.
I'm going to see if there's another question in Orlando. I think that there is.
Yes, can I? The recording that you played during your talk, has a line been drawn, or could a line be drawn between that and the history of like jazz or other music that was at that same time, either through musicians who she worked with who later on and did other things, or through the melodies or the lyrics themselves?
Yeah, well, Zora Neale Hurston, of course, worked with a lot of other people who had recorders in the field. She worked with Alan Lomax, their paths intersected. She was very self-consciously aware of the ways in which the recording industry was beginning to kind of hone in on Black music. Already by the time she started her field work, right, you had, recording studios going out and recording, getting quote unquote authentic Black musical performances. And so, yeah, I mean, Hurston was very aware of this. And she also would talk, periodically people would compare and contrast, for example, the way that, Hughie Ledbetter, Leadbelly, would sing certain songs, certain work songs, versus the types of the styles that she was finding, in rural Florida, or kind of in the peninsula of Florida. She talked about jazz. She really talked about a lot of different genres of music. She was really interested, I think, predominantly though in work songs. That's not the only type of genre of music that she recorded, but I think it's up to us too as listeners, and it's really easy. I actually made some notes. It just occurred to me, I was listening to the clip I played for you guys last night, and I'm like, oh my gosh, this is Sly and the Family Stone. Boom shakalaka, boom shakalaka, gonna take you higher, right? And that, just the track lining song, leads to a whole like genre of different types of musics, jazz, blues, and rock. The other thing that comes to mind too, my students are always astonished when I play like Watermelon Man by Herbie Hancock. And this would have been something I think Zora Neale Hurston would have loved the story. But, Herbie Hancock has told this story now about how he grew up as a young boy, hearing watermelon vendors, go through neighborhoods. And this is also the genesis of August Wilson's immortal play, right? Piano Man, or Piano Lesson, rather, right? The African-Americans coming north to Pittsburgh to sell watermelons. But Herbie Hancock writes this song, and Latin American musicians immediately connect with this. And like when I was in the military, I was actually stationed in Special Forces in Central America. I heard Watermelon Man everywhere. It was playing, instrumentals would play, percussion groups and things like that. And one of the things that, if you talk to some of the Mexican and Central American musicians who played, I want to write a piece about this at some point. Other people have done this, but what they'll say oftentimes in Latin America is they'll say, well, this song, I thought it was from my village, or I thought it was from my part of the world because it was so familiar to me. I grew up hearing this kind of thing, which is again, an exchange from Watermelon Man who are trying to sell their watermelons. And it become, Mongo Santa Maria picks up on this song, Tito Puente picks up on the song, and it just becomes this globally shared music. But again, it's based in, African-American, in this case, Latin American working class experiences. There are so many other examples that we could share. But again, I'm kind of digressing from your original question. I apologize.
Well, I just understand that from the little I've read that she and Al Lomax were frantically trying to get out to the edge, to get in front of this commercialization and the corruption that was happening. They'd be like, oh, let's get you in the studio. Oh, why don't you sing it a little bit differently? Because it'll sound better to the audience. They're trying to capture it before that happened.
Yeah, exactly. And that's why, again, I love August Wilson, because he, in Piano Lesson, there's the whole, the subplot of, the white purchasers of Black musical instruments, right? They want to find the authentic guitar, the authentic Black piano, and so there's this real, sharp awareness, that this is happening.
I think we're got time for about one more question. Is there another question?
I wanted to kind of throw a thing at you that might be of help for all of us with our students, because one of the things that happens in music is that we all have this interesting experience where we hear something and it clicks with us. We don't know why. And you gave a great example there of being in Central America and all of a sudden something clicked with Watermelon Man. And I've seen that over the years where we hear certain rhythms and certain sounds. And you mentioned the connection to Sly and the Family Stone, for example. Somewhere along the way, he heard something, but he may not know where it came from, It could have been the mother singing to the child when they're babies, things like that. My wife has an expression where she remembers songs when her mother was bathing her, as she was an infant, and those memories stay with you, So I just think about that cultural piece coming from what Zora was picking up from the work songs, and I made an immediate transition to Nat Adderley writing work song. So it's interesting to kind of maybe take students that aren't aware of these things to try to see where the connections may have come from, to help them find something that connects to something that may now be a hip hop piece.
Yeah.
But they have no idea where the root cause or the root, the germ of that whole thing came from. But I think you made some really, really salient points, I think, that resonated with me.
Well, thank you. Those are really powerful insights. And, we talked about this morning how these songs like Earth, Wind and Fire, actually, Julian, you like this, during our break, I was doing a playlist, the song Get Away, right? Earth, Wind and Fire, Ghetto Boys, Outcast. And yeah, it's so amazing.
Yeah, I think we can, there's a mega playlist that we might want to think about putting together. I'll get back with you on that.
Okay.
I'm going to turn it over to Scott because we're right at time. I need to wrap this up.
Dr. Paul Ortiz, and thank you to the audience. Thank you to the audience as well. Online, we don't have a count for today, but we know we had about 300 plus attendees. We had 500 plus registrants. So a lot of people were able to take part in this event because it was non-traditional, because it was a webinar and a live audience as well. I want to thank my dean, Dean Lyman Brodie, who just asked that wonderful question, for supporting this event. He's been a very strong supporter, along with Dean Jeff Moore, Dean of the College of Arts and Humanities, and our partners, the Center for Humanities and Digital Research, and the Department of History, for supporting this, because it takes a lot to put together a show like this. It seems like it's a simple webinar, but a lot goes on behind the scenes. I want to thank Kayla Campana, who is online and has been moderating the chat, and to Anna Kephart, who's sitting here, graduate research assistant in public history, Rihanna O'Neill, for her work, also coming here yesterday, Holly Baker, who you won't see here today, but has been instrumental in working with Julian on the podcasts that come out of the festival, that appear a year later, but that have been so instrumental in creating a record, an oral record of these proceedings, the interviews with the participants. And I want to make a pitch for our Afrofuturism syllabus, which is taking the hard work that Julian and Holly have done and the words they're listening to the people, taken it, edited it, and made it available to all of us through the University of Central Florida Library's STARS repository. And the syllabus is accessible through ZORA Festival, the ZORA Festival website. You can also Google UCF Afrofuturism Syllabus, and I believe it will pop up that way. We have 10 weeks of programming already up. We will by Monday have the proceedings of the last 2 days. We'll have them in hand. We may need to do a little bit of editing, but probably within a week, all of these proceedings will be accessible to you through the syllabus. So that's very exciting. We have a class, a 1 credit UCF class, Hurston and Afrofuturism and the Hurston Legacy. And students from that class have been participating online and as part of their course work this week. And we're excited. We're going to be spending weeks going back over these presentations and discussing them. So thank you, everybody, not only the two of my esteemed colleagues here on the screen, but also all of our participants. Dr. Seinskog is here on screen, Dr. Taylor, and I'm going back here. So Regina.
Bradley.
Bradley, and you can see I'm getting tired now. My brain is starting to go frizzle. This is where I kick it back to Julian here. But thank you all so much, and thank you to the team. You can't see them over here, but we have a team of 3 folks who are helping us record this and put this in such a beautiful package. So thank you, and I'm going to hand it back, and thank you to my colleague, especially to Julian Chambliss, who is I said at the beginning, he's the visionary and the driving force behind this Afrofuturism cycle. He's the curator of the 5-year cycle. He's going to tell you, I think, a little bit about what's coming next. So thank you. Back to you, Julian.
Yeah, thanks, Scott. Anything like this is a huge undertaking, and it's a lot of cooperation. I thank my colleague, Carissa West White, who worked very hard helping me with our installation this year at the Hurston Museum. We want to make sure that we mention that A Past Unremembered and Mapping the Sonic Imagination. This is an installation that is on display at the Hurston Museum in Eatonville. A Past Unremembered really explores the sort of forgotten speculative legacy of Black Americans. And A Past, Mapping the Sonic Imagination is a playlist, right? It's intended to be a sound installation that plays in that space that is a glimpse, calling out performers like Sun Ra, like Earth, Wind and Fire, like Janelle Monáe, like Lebeau. I feel good because I made that list and all of them were on it, so I'm not a total idiot. So that's great. As Scott alluded to, we've been working on work with the Association Preserve Eatonville Community, the organization behind the festival, for several years now. This particular cycle on Afrofuturism was a suggestion that I made, and I'm happy that it is coming together. Every year, we're asking a question, and we're programming to provide, at least at some level, an answer. As I alluded to earlier today, this is a massive public humanities project, but it's very much in the spirit of Zora Neale Hurston and the spirit of the Associated Preserve Eatonville community, which, you know, admires so much the focus on arts and letters and Black thought and Black activism at the core of Hurston's sort of legacy. This year, we weathered the storm of the pandemic as best as anyone could by moving things online. But next year, we continue our inquiry with the vision of Afrofuturism. That question is an important one. And I do have a little bit of a video I'd like to show you from an Afrofuturist artist named Tim Fielder, who recently published just this last couple of weeks, Infinitum. And Tim is an ardent fan of Zora Neale Hurston, admirer of hers, and he put this together for the festival, and I really appreciate him doing that. So I'm going to share my screen.
Hello all, my name is Tim Fielder. I'm a New York City-based graphic novelist and visual Afrofuturist, and today I'm here to make a very, very brief presentation of a project I worked on. This is Their Eyes Were Watching God by Zora Neale Hurston, and I experimented with an image from her book. And I would like to show you the sequence of it, and it is a graphic novel page. Please enjoy. I believe that this image may be available at some point from the ZORA Festival. Please feel free to download and enjoy it. Also, my name is Tim Fielder, and you can find my work and my graphic novel, Infinitum, from HarperCollins. And have a wonderful day.
So Tim was kind enough to give us that image, and indeed you can look for that, something that will be available through the festival in the coming weeks and months. But I wanted to use that as a way to preview at some level the same sort of dynamic set of questions that we're asking next year as we've asked this year. You know, when we talk about the vision of Afrofuturism, there are many different answers to that question. What is the vision of Afrofuturism? And as we've tried to do every year since this cycle has started, we're hoping to provide a broad and dynamic scope of possible pathways for the public interested in Afrofuturism to explore. So I hope that you enjoyed this year's set of conversation. As I said, we do have a abundance of digital material and material that live sort of perpetually online that allow you to follow up with these conversations. Our team here has done a lot to make that make this come together. Scott, French, Academics Committee, Trent Tremingo, Tiffany Rivera, all the people whose names you sort of see on page, Clarissa West White. These are people sort of dedicating their time to the ideas represented by a kind of commitment to community and celebration of culture at the heart of Zora Neale Hurston. And our speakers for this cycle, this conference, I think typify the very best in sort of scholarship that's seeking to engage and enlighten. And I really appreciate them taking the time and sharing their knowledge. And it's always a great honor to be in conversation with such dedicated scholars. So my thanks to them and thanks to Scott. And I'll throw it back to him because Scott's the head of the academics committee. He gets the last word.
And to thank Tiffany Rivera, who is our program coordinator and did so much to organize the team here. So my sincere thanks to her. Sometimes it's the people you lean on the heaviest. It's like, oh, well, everybody knows that. But she was here with us yesterday. I hope she's online to hear this right now. We greatly appreciate it. And we appreciate all of you for joining us today. Please stay in touch with us. We will keep you posted but check in on the syllabus for those updates and follow along with the course. And please give us some suggestions on how to improve it as well. And with that, I think that's it. I think we can call it a wrap on year 2 of the Afrofuturism Conference. Thank you all for helping to make this so much fun and such a great success. Thank you all.